Hi everybody, I'm Jim Shore. Welcome to my studio here at the lake. Now this isn't the main studio, which is a few miles from here, but we do a lot of work here. We do design work and we do some of the office stuff and that sort of thing. And it's a nice setting because it's close to the house and it's by our lake. Today I want to talk about something that all of you who know my artwork will recognize immediately, and that's this pile of quilts here. Now this is a little portion of the vintage quilt collection that Jan, my wife, and I have. We have about roughly 600 pieces of vintage quilts. And by vintage quilts, I mean, in our regard, it's quilts that are about from the 1950s earlier. And they go all the way back to the 1700s. And one of the interesting things about these vintage quilts is as you're analyzing fabric, you have to realize that the fabric that is used in a lot of these quilts is comes from, it might be clothing or, feed sacks or something like that, that is from an era earlier than the actual quilt was constructed. So if you have a quilt that, let's say, is around 1900, and you can analyze that by the thread and the type of dyes that they use and the coloration. There's different ways of checking that out. But that fabric might be from the Civil War era, or something like that. In fact, we have older quilts that were put together before we actually started printing cloth in the United States, which was around I think it was 1818, 1820, something like that, that we started printing here. So the cloth that was used was a lot of imported, or it was homespun, or indigo dye and that kind of stuff. So it's interesting to look at it from that perspective. But what I like is the patterning. Now, my grandmother was a master quilter. My mother was a wonderful quilter, and we've been quilt enthusiasts forever. In fact, Jan, my wife, right now is in Paducah, Kentucky at one of the largest gift shows in the country, and that's the Paducah show. That's where the quilt museum is, by the way. And I've given several lectures and shows and so forth there myself. But she's up there, with some of her fabric designs, some of my fabric designs, and so forth, doing a show with her sisters. And so I'm left here, to sort of run the show here. But what I wanted to say is, my grandmother, her favorite quilt was the crazy quilt. And that's a combination of what seemingly is random shapes and arrangements and so forth, but actually they're very well planned out. And it's always a well-made crazy quilt is a study in composition and color balance and a lot of stuff like that goes into any fine piece of artwork. And I think I got a lot of that inspiration, I guess you might say, from my grandmother, sitting there with her and watching her and being around her as she was doing these creative things herself. All these quilts have different patterns, and oftentimes the pattern will be symbolic of something. And when I do my figural pieces and use quilts as the anchor for the design, you might say motif, or what I decorate the piece with, I will try to match the subject of the quilt, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, with the subject that I'm working on. It could be this particular pattern right here, for example, is what's called the log cabin. Typically, it's this kind of rotating colors where you have one side of the color, the diagonal, in a light, collection of colors, and then on the other side, it's darker, heavier, more colorful, and so you can put them together in different things. In this case, you can see it starts forming stripes. It can form pinwheels, or a lot of different things. But typically, the center will be red, or a version of red, and that is called the heart of the hearth, or the heart of the home, and that's right there in the center. So I might use this on something if I'm using, let's say a winter scene where there's a cabin or something like that. I'll use something like this as a backdrop to sort of in a way that myself and the quilters out there will understand what I'm sort of subliminally talking about. There are a multitude of different, we've got cataloged approximately 5,000 different quilt designs that represent different things, and it might be the variation on the 8-pointed star. This is sort of part of it. You can see there's an 8-pointed star here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and this is in a combination that has a particular theme. There's Martha's star, there's Ohio's star, different ones but it's all based on this triangles and squares that make up these patterns. There's the Dresden plates, there's the wedding rings, there's the grandmother's flower garden, there's the bear claws, there's the flying geese, and they're all in these various images to represent that symbolically. In fact, one of them is the drunkard's path. I don't think I've ever used it, but there's tumbling blocks. There's all sorts of them, and they're beautiful. There's nothing like a well-constructed quilt to represent fine craftsmanship and fine artistry. And so I'm always so pleased to use them as the sort of the basis or the background for so many of my pieces. And that there's more to say about this subject. Believe me, I mean, it's a fascinating subject. It's a very interesting history. It's part of our heritage as Americans, and it's something that evokes nostalgia and a lot of other warm feelings when everybody talks about snuggling up under a quilt. So anyway, that's the reason I use it, and maybe as time goes on, we'll research, we'll discuss this subject in a little bit more depth. But for now, I wanted you to get an idea of why it is that I use quilts so frequently, and that's it for today. As I said, as time goes on, we'll discuss these things and some other elements that I use, so you'll get a better understanding of what inspires me and what makes me tick as an artist, and what's behind some of these designs that I do. So until then, be good and be safe. God bless you, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.